In our last episode, we discussed not only the new transoceanic or maritime empires that European states created, but also ways that rulers around the world could maintain and develop their empires, including economic policy and labor systems. As you can imagine, not everything was hunky dory for our empires trying to exert more and more control over their people. In fact, these states regularly experienced both internal and external challenges to their power. We're going to look at multiple types of resistance in today's episode, but first we're going to start with resistance in the American colonies. As Spanish and British control over areas of North and South America expanded, not all of the natives simply submitted to European rule, nor did they just decide to live in harmony and help the settlers. In the Spanish colony of New Spain, which was ruled by an appointed viceroy and extended from Central America into what is today the southwestern US, the Spanish crown's emphasis on converting the natives started to turn sour. At first, Native Amerindians accepted the victory of the Spanish and chalked it up to the strength of their Christian God. And as time went on, we saw a lot of syncretism as more and more natives sought to accept and understand the loss of their culture. However, in the arid southwest region of what is today New Mexico, the Pueblo people were not very happy with what was called the mission system. As part of the colonization efforts, waves of soldiers, priests, and settlers had been moving into the area, and treatment of the Pueblo was not really pleasant. Pueblo who resisted the Spanish were killed, maimed, or even sold into slavery. As resistance dwindled, encomiendas were established, with natives being forced to provide tribute to their Spanish overlords, and because these frontiers were so far from the colonial authorities, priests were basically able to set up exploitative theocracies where they sought to stamp out traditional Pueblo practices. All of this tension really came to a head when drought swept through the region, which led to an empowered resistance movement led by a man named Pope. Pope worked to unite the various towns of Pueblo, Zuni, and Hopi Indians and led a revolt against the Spanish. Pope and his allies attacked. They sealed off roads, they stole horses, and when all was said and done, they ended up killing around 400 people, including 21 of the 33 priests in the region. The survivors fled to Santa Fe and had to regroup. Naturally, though, the independence of the Pueblo in New Mexico was very short-lived, and the area eventually fell back under Spanish control. However, it did force the Spanish to reconsider their religious eradication efforts and grant the Pueblo more land. In the North American colonies of the British, resistance came from several directions. Briefly, I just want you to be aware of a small-scale war between the British settlers in New England, like Connecticut area, and the native peoples there. This one is called King Philip or King Metacom's War, and it was another unsuccessful attempt by native peoples to correct the abuses of colonial life. Raids by various groups of natives against settlers and failed efforts at justice and negotiation between the groups resulted in a war over the winter of 1675 to 1676. After some initial victories, the natives, led by Metacom, were eventually defeated by the British colonists. English settlers in North America also experienced resistance from the enslaved Africans that they purchased in slave markets in the coastal cities. One such event was the Stono Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina. In September of 1739, a man named Jemmy, who had probably been captured in the Kingdom of Congo and shipped across the Middle Passage to South Carolina, put together a group of about 20 other enslaved Congolese who gathered near the Stono River, from where they marched into town. They broke into a general store, they stole firearms and ammunition, and they began marching southward. They were supposedly marching southward because the Spanish had promised freedom to any enslaved African who could make their way to St. Augustine. It was their hope that this would kind of destabilize the British colonies. As the slaves marched south, they shouted "Liberty" and killed any whites they came across. They also grew in number, whether willingly or by forcing any Africans they came across into service. Eventually, the white South Carolina militia ended the rebellion, and by the end of it, 6 plantations had been burned, 28 whites had been killed, and 40 blacks had died. Those slaves who participated in the uprising were either executed or sold off to the Caribbean. As a result of this, the Negro Act of 1740 was passed, which restricted life even further from slaves, banned the importation of slaves from overseas, and attempted to ease some of the cruelty and abuse from white slaveholders that had inspired it. Other slave rebellions continued throughout the British territories and in the United States, including the communities of escaped slaves throughout the Americas and the Caribbean known as Maroon Societies. External challenges to state power also existed, most notably and most excitingly in the form of piracy and smuggling. When we think about our typical Pirates of the Caribbean, we don't think of them in the context of increased state control over the economy and the troubles of enforcing laws over large territorial areas, but we probably really should. In the last episode, we introduced the economic concept of mercantilism, where the government, most often in this case run by an absolute monarch, puts tight controls on exports, imports, and other trade in order to enrich the country. And by country, I mean himself. It's in this environment that groups of individuals who are capable of skirting around the system emerge and start to gain prominence. Pirates began as privateers, ships who have the implied permission of the monarch to harass another country's ships. Particularly, this applied to the rivalry between England and Spain at the time. As Spain's influence and strength began to diminish, its shipments of silver, though, still left the Americas headed for Europe, and other countries were still interested in stealing that silver. As England and the Dutch beat out the Spanish for commercial power and prominence, piracy grew to fill a need, avoiding the prohibitive taxes and trade restrictions to get the people what they want. According to historian Mark Hanna, colonial authorities were often in cahoots with pirates and supported them against the growing power of the crown. However, the social mobility offered by piracy didn't always pan out, and as navies became more organized and state control became more consistent and centralized, piracy started to fade and was eventually chased out by the power of the British Navy. See Pirates of the Caribbean. The golden age of piracy was over, and law ruled the high seas rather than the smugglers and pirates of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. To sum up, state power comes with consequences. Often groups on the fringes who see the growing power of the state as a threat rise up and try to chip away at that power. None of the movements we looked at today were really successful at challenging that dominance. The most successful ones, the establishment of maroon societies in the Caribbean and Brazil, I merely glanced over. But I think that the most important thing to take away here is that empire will always strike back, despite the political, economic, or social challenges that come its way.